In this episode, we consider the extent to which America's extreme and increasingly sticky concentration of wealth in its billionaire class may be dangerous or present problems for its economic and its political systems. And in part two, we'll take a look at the concept of freedom of speech, like real freedom of speech as it exists in the United States, in light of the story of Alexei Navalny in Russia, who was recently died and dealt with issues of speaking out against the authorities in Russia. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me is a man who, when it's time to make a move, he is always ready with a plan. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show the people why you stay scheming?
Always.
All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you please hit subscribe, like on YouTube or whatever your whatever podcast platform you get this on. And that really helps us out as far as spreading this out and getting the word out to more people. Now, we're recording this on February 27th, 2023. And Tunde, we recently saw an item which pointed out that in 2023, inherited wealth of billionaires exceeded the earned wealth, so to speak, of billionaires, which was notable, from their numbers. It's not something that this particular entity had been tracking a long time, but something that was particularly notable in light of the amount of wealth transfer that it does reflect. So what was your reaction to seeing this? And, really, what about it did you find particularly notable?
It's very interesting to me, I think, as someone who deals from a professional standpoint in the areas of wealth, financial planning, so on and so forth. And also just as an American entrepreneur, the idea of building and creating wealth is always, something that's not far from our minds. And excuse me, I think that, it was an interesting thing, 2023. I mean, just to state the kind of main stat and the main point of that article was to bring to light the idea that 2023 was the first year that we had more billionaires created in the United States through inheritance and not through actual, the people themselves creating that wealth through their own entrepreneurial endeavors or investments and things like that. So I think what it represents, which is interesting, is just, it's kind of, I think, reconfirms, because I don't think this is the first sign of this kind of history somewhat repeating itself, but it reconfirms this idea that we're back to a certain type of imbalance in wealth in our country that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, roughly about 120 years ago or so. And so, stuck out to me.
It's the increase in, so it's a lot of actual things compounding together, because there's a large increase of the number of billionaires. The average wealth of billionaires is going up, and then how how these billionaires are getting their money is trending away from them earning it and trending towards, and I guess there was a threshold them in just inheriting it. And to me, I see this as a payoff. This is like the hard work. People have talked about it kind of on the fringes, and I say fringes not to say that it wasn't, people haven't made a good point, but just saying that this isn't necessarily what you'll get from mainstream conversations, but just the concerted and ongoing effort that's been made to take apart kind of the New Deal economic order that existed post World War II and existed really up until the 70s, 1970s, 1980s, and when it was started to be taken apart. And that New Deal order did a lot to restrict the concentration of wealth and to make sure that this isn't to say that you just redistribute wealth for the purpose of redistributing it, but just to make sure that the spoils created by society were distributed in what was considered to be a more fair way across the society. And the belief being that not just to do that out of the goodness out of your heart, but that protects and that strengthens things like market economies. Because when you have in monopolies, for example, the concentration of market power in one entity, which distorts and pretty much eliminates a free market in that sense, a competitive market, then you don't get optimal results. It undermines the concept of a market, and market being to create competition in order to foster higher quality and lower price, because entities are competing against each other. So when you have one person with imbalanced power, it destroys that. And then also from a political standpoint, when you have actors that can wield, due to their economic strength, can wield an exorbitant amount of power relative to everyone else, it's supposed to be everybody has one vote, then that distorts the political piece. So it was a concerted effort in the 1930s, I should say, to make sure that this type of thing wasn't happening. And then basically since 1970s, 1980s, there's been a concerted effort to make it all happen again. And so it seems like it's working, basically. It's like this stuff didn't happen by accident, basically. And we've seen, from time to time, people talk about the estate tax or the top tax bracket of top earners and so forth, or what income goes into that, capital gains and all that stuff. And so all of that stuff is honestly fights about this stuff that a lot of us aren't really picking up on, but some people are paying a lot of attention to because they have a lot at stake.
Yeah, well, money and power like to find each other. So you're right. Those with, the like you said, a lot at stake will take it very serious to lobby the government and our legal system and the financial system to slowly over time get rid of the guardrails that you'd mentioned that were implemented after not only the kind of Gilded Age period, but the excesses of the Gilded Age that partially, we also had just a lot of this stuff like we've talked in recent years, a lot of that was a reaction to just the 100 years prior of the Industrial Age and this new way of societies kind of forming, getting out of the old days of the monarchies and all that stuff and feudalism in Europe. So this is kind of a long arc of continued, how are big societies going to organize each other in a way that, obviously the wealth class that likes to keep power and money and keep that
concentrated
together.
Just to jump in
let me just finish this though. Versus
I want you to go. But I want to throw one thing in for you to go on. It's two competing worldviews that we see, and in that you see the worldview of like the oligarchy. And then you see the worldview of more of a representative democracy type of thing, where where all men have a vote, or all people have a vote, and everybody can participate in the spoils of society and also in the leadership of society, versus the few, those that control all the resources get to have the spoils, and they get to control the actual leadership. So, but go ahead. I just wanted to throw that at you while you were.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen in that arc is the idea of finance, especially starting in the 1800s, outpacing kind of the strength of actual just pure brute force. So, for example, a guy like Genghis Khan could go across Asia and Central Europe with a lot of brute force, with better warriors, the guys on the horseback that could shoot arrows, back to front and all that stuff, and that he could overwhelm his opponents through dominating them by force. And what we've had in the last 200 years with kind of financial engineering, fractional banking, all that, people have begun, and this kind of even from a nation state, we could even refer to things like economic hitman. This idea that through economics we can dominate the landscape, not just through brute force. And I think to your point about these have been topics on the fringe of our discussions as societies. And again, to your point, not fringe like crazy, but just that not a lot of us are paying attention because these are boring things, right? It's not exciting to talk about, financial regulations. It's not exciting to talk about tax codes and how money is kind of confiscated from people and pushed back up into the system.
Yeah.
To things like public schools and fire departments and roads and bridges. So these are the things that,
just adding real quick, particularly because these are a lot of these are chess moves. They're not like people see the checkers move, like, oh, you raise the tax, then, the government collects this much money. But actually or you lower the tax, the government collects this much money. Like that's the first order of the effect. But a lot of these regulations have several orders of effect. And the most interesting things actually are 2 or 3 steps away from the initial whatever the government did with the tax rate or something like that.
Yeah, and the other thing too is just the marketing and how we use language, right? Like the idea of an estate tax. sounds different than when you say a death tax, right? It's a little simplistic, but it works, right? I mean, we have
Yeah.
how many Americans, and there's some interesting stats. I mean, one is I wanted to share before we keep moving too far is Forbes had the amount of billionaires in 1987 at 140, and in 2023 that number was 2,640.
Yeah.
So when I did the math, that's an 18 times increase in 36 years. But if you look at the wealth of the bottom half of Americans, which is about 125 million Americans, it has gone up about 3 times in that period of time. So that, to me, is where the stats bear out, where the rising tide does lift boats over time, but it's an uneven tide. You know, clearly those at the top.
It's not even close. And that's why I always phrase it like, how is society going to distribute the wins, so to speak? And so are we going to distribute the wins in a more egalitarian way? Like, we're all contributing to it to varying degrees. And so are those wins going to be distributed across the board, or is it going to be one person gets 1,000% of the spoils and another person gets 2%, and so how are we going, or 2 times, and so it's one of those, it's a fundamental question as far as how, and to the point you made on how you want to organize society, because these types of things really play into the downstream effects on how society sees itself. And the other thing I'll point out with this, and because I do want to, you mentioned the state tax, and I mentioned it, well, I do want to go into that, because that's actually, if you're talking about specifically the idea of, okay, there are more billionaires being created by inheriting money than earning money, the primary mechanism on a first order, on a first type of, like the first step is the estate tax, and the estate tax exists in the United States. There's been a lot of machinations with it over the past 20 years and a lot of, 20, 25 years, and a lot of arguing over it, because there were some vested interests, a few thousand people primarily that had been working to try to eliminate it or get rid, or reduce it and so forth. But that's the primary defense against vast accumulations of dynastic wealth. But the worldview piece I want to get into just briefly before we go there is just the idea of the concept of forever winners. And I think a lot of people don't really contemplate this, in terms of there is a discomfort with the idea of progressive income tax. And it's like, okay, we don't want to punish people for doing well, or estate tax. Hey, you did well over the course of your life. We don't want to punish people. But what I think is missed a lot of times with that is that the type of system that we have, this market economy system, you don't get to be a forever winner. In the same way that in sports, for example, you don't get to be the champion, and then if you win the championship in 2024, you're not just the champion forever after that. Like, you got to go back the next year and fight again to try to win it again. And so the way these systems have to work, there has to be perpetual competition. That's what you need for a market system. So if you're a market person, if you're a free market person, a free enterprise person, then you need to defend and protect the idea of perpetual competition, which means that just because somebody wins this round in business doesn't mean that they get to stay the winner forever. So that's why you'll have a measure of progressive income tax. You win. Okay, all right, we got to bring you back down, and then you got to go win some more. Or the estate tax. You did a great job throughout your life. Hey, excellent, great job. But we got to bring this down some. We're not taking it all as a society, but you can't start from here. You have to go back and start winning again if you want to still stay on that winner ledger. And I think that concept is one, it's not presented to people in that way a lot of times, where it's just like, oh, okay, well, once you win, you should just be able to sit on your laurels and say, hey, I won. And so this is all over with. And it's like, well, no, perpetual competition is built in to the system that we say that we want as far as markets. If you don't want that, then yeah, we can look at a feudal or system or an oligarch type system. And those are the systems where you have forever winners. But what we find in what history has shown is those aren't the types of areas where you have the innovation like we do in the United States, and where improvements are constantly coming, because what we're leveraging with those are the idea of capital and accumulated capital, but also the perpetual competition.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that you say, forever winners, I wrote down here in my notes, there's also an idea in this country about not creating forever losers. And I think this goes back to the founding of the country. And I thought of this as I was preparing for today, because there's a good piece in one of the Wikipedia things I found, because there was arguments for and against estate taxes. And a lot of the arguments against it came from things like, you're saying is, why should people be punished? who built something big and have already paid taxes along their lifetime, capital gains tax and income tax and all that. And I thought about it where, yeah, I mean, you're right about the forever winner would be like the grandchild of a someone from the Gilded Age today. You know, J.P. Morgan's grandchild or Cornelius Vanderbilt's great grandkids or something like that. But part of the founding of this country was to create a level playing field for each generation. So the idea was
relatively, at least, because remember they were looking at Europe where there were hundreds and hundreds of years of forever winners. Yeah.
So the idea is that, you know, everybody in America can start each generation with a chance, right? So that's one is, you know, allowing people in generations to just sit on wealth creates laziness and certain things that the founding fathers actually wrote about. That, you know, the negative sides of perpetual wealth generation. And then,
does it
on
drive
the flip
innovation?
side,
that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And on the flip side, remember coming out of Europe, right? There were things in England like debtor's prison. Debts would follow descendants. So the thing is that in America, we're lucky to what the idea of probate is, you know, in each state, where when someone dies, there's a legal process that any debts owed by the deceased need to get paid off first. Everything else goes to the heirs. Now, there's loopholes created to get around all that, which we don't have time to get into. But the idea is just that, yeah, once that debt is paid, if I die with, let's say, just hypothetically, $20,000 in credit card debt, and I had $1 million cash in the bank, technically the probate process is supposed to allow that the debtor gets the $20,000, my family gets $980,000. But my family is not responsible for the debt. My kids don't have to deal with the negative credit effects and all that. Yeah. So that's why we kind of accept that on the one end. We like that part of as Americans, but we don't. We kind of take the rhetoric of the ruling class in a sense. You know, the really wealthy that want to manipulate us into not seeing the side that perpetual wealth generation without any interruption can also long-term harm the society.
Well, yeah, I mean, in another area where like that we see in our society where perpetual losing is not a part of it is bankruptcy. The whole concept of bankruptcy is one of that you can take a risk, and if it doesn't play out the way you hope, then you're not just and you're not going to just be subjected to debtor's prison or just some kind of purgatory forever. You know, like you can get back on your feet, so to speak. And so these things are built in. Again, a lot of times we don't learn and we're not exposed to the reason for it. But the idea is you want more activity, not less. And so that's what you risk when you start stacking a lot of money at the top and it never has to come back down. You risk that. And so one of the things that again gets directly at this is the idea of an estate tax. And again, we've seen it pop up from time to time in our discourse, in our political discourse. A lot of times you'll see the Republican Party pushing to either get rid of it or make it so that people pay less, whether that be, various mechanisms and so forth. And you'll see the Democratic Party a lot of times saying that it needs to remain in place or that, trying to preserve it or something. So it has become a partisan issue that people view partisan in a partisan frame, not necessarily in a frame of, notably, people don't view this in a frame of whether or not how this affects their own pocketbook a lot of times. And that's one of the benefits of making an issue partisan, because obviously if something like the estate tax was just based on how does it affect my own pocketbook, then the vast majority of Americans would be in favor of it, because the estate tax as it's set up affects relatively very few Americans. You're talking about estates that right now, I believe the number you said that you pointed was it's 13 million is the baseline exemption. And then after you get over that, they start looking at the estate tax. So from the standpoint of the estate tax, though, what do you see its present role? And then also, like, what do you take away from how historically it's existed in the United States in terms of maintaining the type of homeostasis that we were talking about previously in an economic and we haven't gotten there yet, but in the political systems?
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, in preparing for today, I mean, there's some interesting stats I found. So I'll start with kind of the first question about today, and then let's get into some history. So, as of in 2021, there was, I guess, the most recent year for numbers. 2,584 estates in the United States paid federal estate tax. So, when you think about that, that is definitely less than 1/1000th of 1% of the US population. No, I mean, it's serious. Like, I was thinking, like, wow, that's that little amount of people out of 330 million people or estates paid estate tax. And it shows you, like we're talking about, and it kind of confirms the outsized influence that this small group of Americans, plus I would say their cohorts, people like me in my industry that help them manage all this stuff. So I'm not innocent. Let me be honest. But it shows us the outside influence that not only they have in lobbying the government and the legal and financial system, but also those of us who benefit from all the activity around their wealth. And that's something that I'm happy to get into later about the kind of the ecosystems and the economies within now our overall system that help promote all this. Because that's family offices, the accounting and legal firms that help people deal with all this. So, but if you think about it, I'm just going to quote from the article that we're basing our discussion on today. As I mentioned, the bottom 50% of Americans in terms of wealth is about 125 million people. They collectively owned 1.1 trillion as of January 2023. That's how much, it says here in the article, that's how much the 8 richest people in the U.S. own together based on current net worth in Forbes. So I think that's really the choice we...
8.
Yeah, 8 people.
Yeah.
So 125 million Americans have the same net worth as 8, let's be fair and maybe say 8 families, right? But the point I'm really making is that it's not a right or wrong, right? This goes back to Sapiens when we did the show on that book, that there's no human rights in nature. We got to decide it's about our culture as Americans. How do we want to split this all up?
It's a worldview, or how do you organize large societies, as you started our conversation with? Like, how do we want to organize our society?
Before we go into history, but I just want to finish on this one with this current stat of the now. When thinking about, just from a math perspective, so if 2,584 estates is less than 1% of less than 1/1000th of a percent of the U.S. population, I took a look at, well, how much does the federal Treasury bring in every year, specifically through the estate tax? It's averaged in the last decade or two around 2 to 3% a year. So I just thought, okay, so if you're looking for revenue, right now our budget deficit is almost 2 trillion. We're bringing 4.44 trillion, and we spend about 6.18 trillion. So again, tweaking little things. We got 0.001% of the population, which is adding 2 to 3% annually to revenue. If you boost that up to 0.002, maybe we get another 5% of revenue coming in without having to hit the majority of Americans with a greater income tax, sales tax, property tax, all the other taxes that, like you said, the majority of the country experiences. Yeah. So, I want to kick it back to you for the history part.
Well, I'm not. I want a general reaction as well, though. Okay. And the piece that, to me, and it ultimately does go to the question of, like, whether you support the estate tax, whether you oppose the estate tax. It does. I think it has to be emphasized that this is not a question of, or this, I should say what it is. This is a question of how you want to organize a large society, and what values do you want to promote in the society. And so what it happens to be essentially is that, and this is, I broke it down before, if you value things like markets, market economies, like representative democracies, or AKA republics that are based on elected officials, then the estate tax is a piece of that. And it's been observed over the history of the United States. If you don't have mechanisms like progressive income tax or estate tax, then what ends up happening is that you can't maintain those systems. You can't maintain those market systems. You can't maintain those representative democracies. So what we're talking about a lot of times with the estate tax is the preservation. A lot of people think, and you just talked about the estate tax from this point of a government raising revenue. But I think the bigger issue is the estate tax is a mechanism of the preservation of the system that we have set up. Now, if you want to change the system, if you want to go to a different system, one where, hey, regular people, working people, don't worry about how the country's being run, just let the oligarchs handle it, then that's the type of situation that we go that direction. And yeah, the estate tax is unnecessary at that point because we've decided to just let the landlords, so to speak, in a feudal way, just run everything, and we'll just live on the land, or be owned with the land, so to speak, and go for it. But if you think there should be some level of self determination in each generation and each person, there should be the ability to go start a business and be able to do so in a way where you're not immediately swallowed up by whatever industries are, that large businesses are already there. Or if you think that the people should have a role in choosing their leadership with free and fair elections, and actually be able to get information on what's actually happening, not just being told what they people want them to know, then these are the type of things we have to do to prevent the extreme concentration of wealth and the extreme concentration of power. And so, to me, when I look at the estate tax, it's that balancing that we're trying to strike. You don't want to just take everything from somebody when they die. You like to create some type of incentive structure to accumulate, to continue to win. We want to create an incentive for that. But at the same time, the balance has to be struck where we're not going to a society where you have the forever winner. And so therefore Michael Jordan's kids are NBA champions now as well, because he won, and so that's not the way that we have a system that's based on people as opposed to assets, so to speak. So, but I know you're chomping at the bit to get into the history. So from a historical standpoint, what stands out to you about that?
I was intrigued because you made me realize somewhere I can find an island and create that country for myself, where Michael Jordan's kids are also champions.
Yeah, they're the champions. Yeah, they inherited it.
No, and I think it's just, before we get into the history part, it's just, again, I think you reiterate why this is dangerous for what we would consider stable societies. I think a lot of people...
Well, just a society that we say that we like. We say that we like markets. Exactly. We say that we like republics. Well, these are the types of things that have been put in place by founding fathers who experienced the other side. This is the stuff they were like, hey, these are the things we got to watch out for. So let's address these types of things.
Well, and the reason on the why is because what they found at those times is that once generational wealth is concentrated after several generations, and the article alluded to this too about just modern Americans as well. They found, because this is more about just human personalities, the first generation is usually connected to society because they created the wealth. So they probably came out of either poverty or middle class, and they dealt with everybody. And think about the way
the wealth. A lot of time, you have to have your hand on the pulse of society.
And think about, just for us all here in America, right? We know that the children of billionaires and 100 millionaires generally are not going to public school, so they aren't as exposed to those of us in society, regular folks, people with up and down financial situations. They're in a cocoon with people like them. So after 2 or 3 generations of that, they're more concentrated emotionally in protecting their wealth and seeing those outside their bubble as somehow a threat to their wealth. So that's when you get conversations in the United States like, people like Bernie Sanders, who might say we need universal health care. Some people will say he's actually a communist for that. Whereas the definition of communism and, European style kind of just having some safety nets are 2 different things. So I think that's important to understand in terms of what you're saying. Like, why would these guys be on here talking about allowing estates to just accumulate without any mechanism, like you say, to kind of spread that wealth back into society over time in every generation, at least a portion of it, to your point, not all of it. I think that's why. And then if we go back into the history, the founding fathers pretty much gave us this, right? They understood that to have a society that stays within some sort of equilibrium, that doesn't get too top heavy and kind of top over on itself, like the European monarchies were doing at the time by the late 1700s. They not only needed to have things like the beautiful things they gave us, like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and also this concept of co-equal branches of government. So they structured that way. But they also understood, and this is something I'll ask you to chime in on, not only things like the taxes. We did have what's called a stamp tax in 1797 as a way to collect revenue after the death of one generation between another. But also the idea, like corporations back in the founding of the country weren't to be in perpetuity for certain reasons. So that's where I'll throw back to you for that enlightenment.
Well, yeah. I was going to take it a little bit of a different direction.
Okay.
And, like, because I do want to keep us moving. And I wanted to point out, and this is something that is worth saying during this time. Now, granted, yes, to your point, at the founding of the country, and this, it's a different world than it was then, but it was understood that, for example, corporations wouldn't be perpetual. Like the suspicion against mass accumulations of wealth and mass accumulations of power were present, as you point out, because their perspective, their context was one that came from the seeing what was happening in Europe, where you had hundreds and hundreds of years of dynastic wealth accumulated, and how that created stagnant societies, didn't lead to innovation and so forth. And the places where you had more dynastism was where you had more activity happening and where you had innovation and things like that. Whether it be places, you look at places like like the Netherlands or something like that, and in England taking a lot of cues from there. But where I wanted to go with this is just kind of another structural point that I think is very important in understanding generally what we're talking about here is that the market system that we have and capitalism, which I look at what we're talking about here is a defense of capitalism, and for capitalism to continue to keep moving. A lot of times, I think it's misunderstood in the fact that capitalism, the purpose of capitalism, the way it works is that you invest capital and then you attract money to that capital essentially by selling goods and services. You invest in something, and then you from that you're supposed to get more back than your capital. That's why you invested the original capital, is you get a return on investment. And so that's money rising up through the system. And money rising up through the system creates economic activity that is good for everyone. The issue that you run into with capitalism, which has been observed, I mean, this is Great Depression stuff. There's been observed several times throughout the history of capitalism. Basically, is that you need places where capital will continue to rise to the top always. Over the course of time, every investment doesn't hit, but enough hit that capital rises to the top. If you do not have a mechanism to get that some of that capital, it doesn't have to be all of it, but some of that capital to get back down at the bottom so that it can rise back up to the top, then the system will break down. The economic system will break down because all of the economic activity is happening during, and you call this the velocity of money, while the money rises from the bottom to the top. That's all the jobs that people are working. Everybody's taking a piece of the money as it goes back up, and then it gets to the top. And then if it stays there, you start drying up. And what we see in America right now, actually, what this has lended itself to, because we don't have a good, right now, our mechanism to push money back down to the bottom has been lacking for the last, let's say, 40 years, is America has just been borrowing money. And we borrow money. We borrow as a nation. We borrow money. We increase our national debt from whatever it be, 2 trillion to 30 trillion over the course of that time. And the reason being is that we've allowed the money. We keep allowing the money to accumulate at the top, and the only mechanism to put more money at the bottom so the economic system can keep going is to borrow it. And so, and I know you had something on that. I do want to move, but I wanted to throw it to you on I know you had some numbers that stood out to you as far as the borrowing piece, and essentially. The people who say we have a deficit problem, which I agree, a debt problem, a deficit being each year how much we're in the red versus a debt problem, which is the cumulative amount, they're all right. But the issue that we have is that we need that right now in order to keep our economy rolling, keep this system running where we have money flowing up through the system. If we want to correct that, what we have to do is stop having so much money stick at the top. So, I
was laughing because you're confirming why no one likes to pay attention to this topic.
No, for sure. But I do want to. I did want to.
It's appreciated. Your
if anybody's made it this far, they deserve that piece of information.
We're not going to be on the algorithms with this topic on this week.
Yeah. For sure.
No one's looking this stuff up.
Just real quick, if you got a minute on it, do you see a way that, to make Americans care about this kind of thing? Or is this are we literally the problem we run into is that the people who care about this are the people who have hundreds of thousands or millions or billions at stake, and everybody else, the other 50% who, combine for 1 trillion of wealth, this doesn't affect them, in terms of a first order and directly. And so it's much more fun to pay attention to books to burn or books to ban in schools or to, sex scandals or whatever. That stuff is much more interesting than this, to our detriment for this show. So is there a way?
Yeah, I was going to say, besides the billionaires and 100 millionaires who have it in their interest to lobby the government to not include these, there are a few people on the fringe like us that for some reason find this interesting, but we don't have the power to do anything except talk this on a microphone about it. But no, I do think so. It's very interesting to your point and the points we've been making. We should all have a concern, and I want to say this too. Not because wealthy people are bad people, or because they shouldn't have wealth and all that. And in fairness to the exponential number of billionaires created, this is all coming off the heels of a generation, literally 21 years of lower than normal interest rates that created multiple asset bubbles and the longest bull market in history and U.S. history in the stock market. So it's understandable that wealth has risen.
I thought everything was bad right now, man. What are you talking about?
Oh yeah,
don't we need to make we need to make America great?
I'm on the wrong show.
What are you talking about, man? Things are terrible right now. It couldn't be the longest.
That's actually an interesting thing, because if the system were healthy in terms of our political class, I wouldn't be saying that over this record last 20 years of bull markets and all that the estate tax exemption was allowed to go from 675,000 to 13.6 million over that time. We should be, as a nation, that's what could help the deficit, and say, okay, well, if we have this exponential growth in wealth, especially at the top tier, then if we collect some of that back and put it back in the treasury, we won't have a $35 trillion deficit. And I recognize that,
and we'll have a healthier
start
system.
Wars in the Middle East for 20 years and all that stuff while we're cutting taxes. So there's a lot of decisions that have been made collectively by us as voters, by voting people into office who then did the bidding of people who are a lot wealthier than most of us watching this. So, but to get to your question about where do we go from here? So I felt like the article alluded to something I think that's really important for us as Americans. And I'll quote here, because it says, rather than becoming disillusioned with the idea of fairness, growing inequality, like if we see the inequality continue to grow, might lead people believing more strongly that society is fair. And I realize, because there's a lot of people that think of the Darwinism thing, like, oh, well, you either sink or swim in our society, blah, blah, blah. So, and that theory goes that inequality is so great that it needs similarly great justification. This goes back to the way our minds work as humans. Remember, we talked about this in totally separate conversations.
So do you see a solution to this, though?
It's interesting, because where they're going with it is that we will tend to manipulate our minds to believe that this explosion of billionaires doesn't necessarily reflect as much of an imbalance in society, or maybe their ability to manipulate, like we've talked about, governments and the legal and financial system to their advantage. It represents that they worked harder and the rest of us didn't. And I think that we are at risk for potentially making that a permanent thing, because remember, like we talked about, the Europeans didn't look at the Africans as inferior until it became in the interest of the capital markets during slavery. And and we've lived with that for hundreds of years culturally. Yeah, and this could be something similar too.
And I think the living memory piece is what that's the key phrase, is that there were generations of Americans who saw a more egalitarian system, a system where society did well and the spoils of society of coming from society doing well were broadly shared amongst everyone. You had the society doing well didn't lead to the greatest explosion of billionaires ever. It led to the creation of the largest middle class ever, and so, but there were still rich people, rich people, but it was that everybody was going up. And so instead you had a middle class, the largest middle class being created, in addition to wealthy people getting wealthy. And so once people that have seen that start not exiting society, so to speak, then you run into this situation like you're talking about, where everybody looks around like that's just the way it is. They don't appreciate the subtle things that are done, as far as whether it's lowering the top tax bracket, which was a big deal, or whether it be playing with the estate tax, or all the little subtle things that were done to balance the system, to, I would say, imbalance, but to balance the system and to bias the system towards large accumulations of wealth. And so they think that's the natural way for it to be. So, but that's more of a point to say that there's an urgency now that we can get to the point where people start thinking that this is just the only way that things could ever be. There is no other alternative than the people, the capitalist class, so to speak, or the billionaire class, taking all the spoils and leaving everybody else to fight over the other thing. I think that it's the answer to the question though is the most simple answer and the least fulfilling answer, so to speak, and that is that over the past however many years, let's say 40, 50 years, you've just seen money have a greater influence in the fourth estate, media, in private ownership of media, and that will then present information in ways that benefits the few as opposed to from a societal standpoint. Like you'll see that, and then also the concentration and the ability to use greater concentrations of wealth directly in the political system. So the ability to influence and inform people from the perspective of from media corporations that are owned by the billionaire class, so to speak. That's something that we see now. And then also things like Citizens United did the Supreme Court decision that says, the corporation is a person and can can do what they want to do from I guess everything but vote or go to jail. Corporation can't go to jail, things like that. So I would say a corporation is not a person, but
sounds like I want to turn myself into a corporation then.
Hey,
go to jail and I got like freedom of speech. This is awesome.
Freedom of speech, yeah. Political.
And I get a lower tax rate than an individual. Yeah. So hold on, wait a second. I got a new joke. So they got this transgender thing now the last decade where people like kind of not sure and they call themselves they. What if I became like a transhuman to a corporation? So
I think you might be onto something, man.
Yeah, all right. I got to figure that out.
You better get your lobbying hat on. I told you, stay scheming, man. Stay scheming. It's a different
kind of they, but yeah, I'll be a corporate entity.
Yeah, identify as a corporate entity. I think
a Terminator because I can't be a human. But so anyway.
So, but I think that it's follow the money basically is the answer. Like you got to break these, at least do more. And again, this is not like the natural order way things have to be. These are decisions that were made, whether it be decisions on antitrust and ownership, decisions on the responsibilities of media, decisions on court, decisions on the corporate personhood and corporate donations and stuff. So those are the types of things we have to look at. And I don't know that Americans. Rank and file will ultimately care about this stuff, but people who do recognize the threat will have to participate in the system and
you know who recognized it. And I know you want to move. The founding fathers recognized it because Americans. It'll be an issue when Americans are on the street with pitchforks because that's kind of what
they had to fight a war. And so the goal would be to not have to fight a war, or the people who realized it also were the people after the Great Depression, but they had to go through the Great Depression, and so it'll eventually happen. And it'll just be a matter of how much pain do we have to experience. And so right now we're kind of on the forefront saying, hey, if we can kind of get this under control, we don't necessarily have to go through the depths. But we do want to get out of this topic. We'll catch you on the next topic after the break.